I am pleased to introduce our Maritime Distinguished Speaker Series lecturer, Chris Goldblatt. Welcome back to SBMM. Chris is founder and CEO of Fish Reef Project and is the inventor of Sea Cave. His mission is to ensure long-term ocean health by turning empty seafloor into thriving marine ecosystems home to millions of marine animals. He has more than 40 years of fishing and diving experience, in addition to being an early pioneer of the sustainable seafood movement. Along with inventing Fertile Urchin, a biotech fertilizer made from purple and red urchins' waste shells, Chris has contributed to several marine-related publications and is the author of the Luke Dodge Ocean Adventure series. Chris received his Bachelor of Science degree in Fisheries and Business from Cal Poly Humboldt and has been a guest lecturer at UC Santa Barbara. He has been an International Seabed Authority observer, contributor, and speaker since 2014. In 2018, he was the invited guest speaker at the Civil Society Forum of the Blue Economy Conference in Nairobi, Kenya. Please join me in welcoming Chris Goldblatt.
Well, thank you for that wonderful introduction. Can everybody hear me okay out there? Fantastic. Well, first of all, let me start by thanking everybody who supports the museum, because Santa Barbara's cultural identity is inextricably linked to our maritime history, and only through the museum can we really keep that going. So thank you for supporting the museum. So let me start tonight's lecture by opining a little bit about mankind's relationship with conservation. When I was a young boy, it was hard to find a halibut or a white sea bass. The gray whales hadn't yet been delisted. A lot of the marine pinnipeds hadn't yet fully recovered from the 18th and 19th century hunting. Now those animals are almost entirely ubiquitous, and that goes for bald eagles. We have a lot of bald eagles. You have the California condor. There's a lot of success stories, and the reason for that success is because when mankind causes environmental damage or impact, it's never the intent. It's bad planning, maybe ignorance, a little bit of greed, but it's not the intent. Building the industry or something, that's the intent. The impact is the byproduct. But when mankind sets forth to repair that damage, we're really quite good at it. And we don't give ourselves enough credit for that. We don't really look at the success stories. So the Sea Cave and the Fish Reef Project is sort of the latest in a succession of really positive outcomes that humans have come up with in order to really turn the tide and increase ocean health overall. 3 years ago, was it, that I came to the museum and I announced the Sea Cave as a primary restoration invention. So I feel really fortunate that we were able to announce the Sea Cave in the same place that we're coming back, and we're sharing with you this great story of efficacy over the past 3 to 4 years. I'd like to thank the Independent and TV Santa Barbara with Senator Sinclair and Nonprofit Connect for getting the word out initially. These were really wonderful press opportunities. So the way the ocean works, well, one of the way the ocean works is, most life starts as zooplankton with animals, phytoplankton for plants, and it just kind of drifts along. I think the definition of plankton is something that can't swim against the prevailing current. So you can make the case that somebody who's passed out and floating in the ocean is a piece of plankton, right? So it floats along, and it needs to settle on structure and grow, whether it's a plant or an animal. So it really is a fair comparison to that structure is an oasis in a desert. And what most people don't realize is most of the ocean, 99.9% of the ocean seafloor, is what you call depopulate, empty sand and mud. It's not lifeless, but there's not thriving reef structures all over the ocean, kind of like we're led to believe through watching Nat Geo or Little Mermaid, things like that. The public consciousness is that it's everywhere. In fact, it's quite rare. But reefs and habitat are where all of the life exists. So how do we make more of it? Well, in the early 1970s, when they put up the 200-mile international limits around the world and gave 200 miles to each country as their sovereign national waters, in Japan, they decided they needed to increase their domestic food production because they couldn't necessarily fish up against everybody else's shores. They called those distant shore operations at the time. And they came up with a series of artificial reef structures at the time. They were focused, they were species specific. So you might have one just for abalone, you might have one just for lobster, you might have one just for sea urchin, you might have one just for kelp. And they're somewhat inefficient to make, but it was a good start. So the Fish Reef Project, founded formally in 2011, we wanted something that worked, that was a one-size-fits-all. I know, it sounds dangerous, right? But we set that as a goal. So how do we create a reef structure that is really good for growing kelp, that is really good for lobsters, that's really good for abalone, that's amazing for fish? And after starting with a survey of the Japanese technology and internal discussions, we designed the sea cave. And that's it. It's a 1-ton structure. It's 6 feet by 4 feet by 3 feet tall. And one of the keys is that it can be mass produced. And I realize saying mass production kind of conjures up thoughts of cheapness, but it's exactly the opposite. We're able to make this at an extremely high threshold of quality, but we're able to make one of these in about 1.5 minutes. Now let me compare that to the other reef structures around the world that take anywhere from 2 days to 2 weeks to make one. So this is what they look like when they're inverted. There's little tiny models up here if anybody would like to kind of turn them over and look at them. It's deceptively simple, but so is a rocket, right? Rocket looks pretty simple. I'm pretty sure there's some engineering in a rocket, just ask Elon Musk, right? So this has the collective minds of like hundreds of years of people underwater, including myself, just staring at the best possible structure for everything down there. And it's just chambered enough to allow the fish to swim through, to allow the sand to flow through it. It has this beautiful, gentle turtle shape that allows large kelp holdfasts, which are the base of the kelps, to settle on and grow. And this is kind of an AutoCAD design. And this is where you start. You start with a sketch on a pad of paper. You hire an engineer. In this case, an engineer donated his time early on. And you start playing with certain shapes. Here's Tony Huerta in the lower left, who's been with the project since day one. And this was being poured. The first molds that we had made them made in Indiana. They were trucked out here, and we made them in a facility down off of Milpas. We poured the first sea caves. And it was rough going in the beginning. The concrete stuck. You have to understand, we started from a zero knowledge base. There was no roadmap how to make these, how to build them, how to deploy them, how to permit them, how to engage with the public. There was no prior existing knowledge base of any kind. So it was a 100% learning curve. So everything, when you have limited resources, comes down to your best guess in the end. So we were very happy that ultimately we were able to yield this. This is in our yard in Ensenada, Mexico. We have a sister organization independently managed called Fish Reef Project Mexico. And we ultimately were able to make 8 functional molds out of fiberglass. The yard can make about 150 a month at this point. And ironically, or coincidentally, the ship that's capable of deploying them in Mexico also fits 150. So it's a nice match. So this is what it looks like when you lift it. The set time is anywhere from 12 to 24 hours. You can pour them one day and remove them and truck them and load them the next day. You do have to be a little bit careful. They're a little bit tender. Technically, concrete needs 30 days to fully cure, and when you hit it, it kind of rings like a bell, and that's how you know it's done cooking. The concrete formulation is really important, the chemistry of it. So the pH of normal concrete, I think, is about 10. It's quite caustic, so the really sensitive plants and animals won't settle on it. If you take road material, for instance, and throw it in the ocean, you won't get much that grows on it, and it'll probably break up. So that was another part of the experimentation, was getting the mix design exactly right to where it would have a 500-year design life, and there was no porosity, so there was no leaching of anything into the marine environment, and it also reduced the pH to match seawater, so 7.3. So that allows the small kelp plants and corals and soft corals to settle on it like it's a natural thing. Now, we have this term that we call biogenic reefing. I don't subscribe to the term artificial reef, because that conjures up sunken ships, which are fine, but that's more of an attraction device. And it's clear that humans made a ship, or whatever other material, tanks, or whatever else you put down there. And they do work for their purpose. But what the Fish Reef Project strives to do is emulate Mother Nature in design and function. So after these go down, after a few years, when they're fully grown over, you should be able to swim over them, and it looks almost like nature put it there itself. They're not giant, obtuse things. They're very pleasant to look at. This is our commercial dive team. So this is when we were deploying off of Mexico. We have a 55-acre lease on the front side of a pristine volcanic island called Isla San Martin off of San Quintin, Mexico. It's about 5 hours south of the border, and it's in a wonderful spot because the current boomerangs off of Point Conception, the California current. It goes behind San Nicolas Island. It travels down the coast, and then it slams into the coast right here. So you get this permanent upwelling and perfect ideal kelp growing regions that are somewhat a buffer against harsh El Niños. And that's what we look for around the world. We look for refuges where we can make kelp and coral ecosystems that are kind of resilient to things like coral bleaching or coral die-offs, things like that. This is the Argos, so this is the 150 loaded, and this is anchored off of San Martin. And when we go to make our project off of Goleta, we'll have a kind of a scaled version of this. What we do is we designed a bar that we pick 4 up, and we lower them in the water 4 at a time, and we even invented a trigger device that lets go once they're on the sea floor. So that way they can be nicely engineered in a particular pattern, and then the 4 are kind of married together. They kind of stratify each other, so when very large swells come through, they don't move. I was just down there 2 weeks ago because there was a 30-foot swell that went over this spot for about 10 days. It just hammered this spot. And last year, I think it was Hurricane Hillary went directly over this spot too. So it was a really wonderful test for stability, for oceanic stability. And of course, the findings were that I couldn't even tell anything happened. There was no sanding in, none of the sea caves flipped over, none of them moved. Clearly resilient. So there's a nice drone shot. And then you can see our workers up in the right. That was kind of a rare day. I put that picture up in the one in the corner. I put this in there twice because I took that, and I think everybody in here has a sense of how hard it is to get a perfect underwater picture like this. I think maybe 6,000 pictures were taken until you go, okay, that's the one that tells the whole story. And there it is. And they're built in this beautiful hub and spoke configuration. I found that when the center of something is strong, the rest of it tends to remain strong. So the sea cave has a very, very thick, wide center mass to it. It's 5 inches thick. And then we actually build the reefs with a thick center mass where there's a number of hundreds in the center. And then they kind of radiate out like the fingers on your hands, because that's the most closely mimics what I see in nature when I swim over at kelp forests. Blue technology is a new term, right? But Santa Barbara has been doing it for 100 years. Santa Barbara has been a leader in blue technology. If it had to redefine itself, it would be called a blue technology hub. And that goes for everything. That goes for the Kirby dive helmets. That goes for LAD's first use of an ROV. It goes for Bob Evans' force fins. It goes for the wonderful photography of Ernie Brooks, and all the way on down the list. The wonderful science done at UCSB. We tend to be leaders in sustainable fisheries. I include Yater surfboards as blue technology because still nobody has managed. Those are the Stradivarius of surfboards, right? Okay, so this is, we work in seven different locations, distinct locations in Baja. the big hook that sticks out is called Punta Henia or Punta Eugene. And it's very exposed to a lot of currents down there. And that's the first place we deployed. And then I came back 7 months later. And kelp's a very interesting thing because it will seed, like seeds in the desert, that it will sit there in the mud and just wait for 20 years until it rains, and then it will germinate, then it will pop. And that same thing happens with kelp, where you get seeding, and then when the right conditions hit, then it will grow. In this case, that all happened in a 7-month period. So this is what it looks like when it first takes hold. Now, when I say it's deceptively simple, but it's highly engineered, what you see is a 1-inch lip that was intentionally put on there, because we know from our experience that when the kelp is going, it needs just a little start. It just needs a little start. Most other reefs are kind of convoluted. There's a lot of different places for different things to hide. Cryptic area, they call that, and that does serve its purpose, but we prefer to take the stance that you just help nature get started. And that's exactly what's happened here. So this is a young Macrocystis pyrophora giant kelp getting started 7 months later. Right? When I first saw this, I couldn't believe it. I went down there and I burned an entire scuba tank just staring at it. Because it had 30 kelp plants on it. We figured at best there would be 4 to 5, right? There were 30, and it was to the surface. And there were full-size sheephead, full-size calicos, lobster, abalone. You'll see that in a moment. Here's some other close-ups. Now, we do have a kelp outplanting or transplanting program where you do take juveniles from high density to low density, which is this area, and you strap them down with wire, and that does work. You can kind of force it, but we found there, and likely also in Goleta, that that's probably highly unnecessary, and the reason is, if you place these reefs within 1 to 3 miles of natural healthy kelp beds, those provide the seed stock. And in Goleta, there's healthy kelp on both sides of where we're going to deploy. So whether the current's going north or south, you will get good seeding. You can see that it grows on every surface on the sea cave, even on the feet. So we weren't sure if it would grow on perfectly vertical surfaces. We weren't quite sure how it was going to take. And the way that kelp works is it just kind of grows everywhere, and then it kind of merges into a few large plants over time. So you can see the large sheephead on the left. When you start seeing large mature fish, it's a very good sign, because large mature fish are really smart. They've survived to get to that point. And they go in and they say, this is now prime real estate. This is Manhattan real estate. They're moving in there. Nobody's taking it from them. So that's a very good sign. You can see that little plaque on the left there. That's because I interned my late mother in that one, and that's why it's called Tina Reef. And again, a 1 in 10,000 shot of calicos. Calicos they're very smart fish. They're just a smart fish. So when you know that you have large amounts of them, that they have made this their home. They're what we would call in the fishing world home guards. And you have female juvenile sheephead on the left. It's good to see juveniles and mature adults mixing in. And you know, the calicos are just kind of ubiquitous. You can see some small brown algae starting on that one. We call that understory, right? Understory is the little stuff. So that would be like laminaria, something called dead man's fingers, dulse. Understory is really, really important because it creates the mixture of what you call the algal community that things like abalone really need. They typically want a mixture of different marine vegetation in order to thrive. Here we go, giant sea bass, right? So this is about a 100-pounder, and it's probably about a 20-year-old fish. And I had to take this from a video, so I apologize for it's a little bit blurry, but I burned half a scuba tank trying to get him to hold still so I could take a picture of him. But he or she is clearly using the reef, right? And, you know, a little history on nomenclature here. When I was a kid, this was called a Jewfish, right? And which I kind of, you know, coming from Jewish heritage myself, I always kind of liked that name, right? It's kind of like free advertising, right? So, and then in 1980, when it became a protected species, they changed the name to black sea bass, and I don't know, nobody seems to know why. Okay, and now, what is it called? It's called a giant sea bass, right? So now, I don't want to leave anybody out, so when I describe this fish, I call it a giant black Jew bass. So there you go. It's the home. But this segues into, California lends itself to gigantism. The state itself is gigantic, but it has the largest, fastest growing thing in the world, the Macrocystis pyrophora, the giant kelp, which is a kind of a red color. It has the largest abalone in the world, the red abalone, Haliota rufescens. It's twice or 3 times as large as the runner-up from South Africa. We have the largest tree, the Sequoia sempervirens, and the largest sea urchin, the red sea urchin, right? And we also have the largest taxes. Yellowtail, right? This is extremely important, and here's why. Because there's a big debate in the reefing world about whether you need high profile, some giant thing that comes off the bottom, or low profile. This was a big issue when they built a 300-acre reef off San Onofre as mitigation for the nuclear power plant down there. But what the sea cave does is, because of the hollow construction, the semi-pelagic species such as yellowtail identify the sea cave through the lateral line, through basically like a sort of biogenic transducer. They sense the sea cave as if it's a big giant thing. So you don't need high profile in order to have the full complement of marine life, which would be yellowtail and calico bass, which would be giant sea bass and sheephead. So when I say one size fits all, we got a bullseye on that one. More calicos just because I like them. Lobster, this was a big question, okay? Panulurus interruptus. And a lot of people said, no, you need a lot of cryptic area, you need a lot of little ledges, they're underwater cockroaches, and that's the only way that they're gonna fit. And I said, no, I've caught enough lobster in my life and spent enough time staring at where they're living that yes, if they have a choice between a cute little ledge and something like this, they'll pick the cute little ledge. But if it's just open sand and you put something like this, they will migrate. And that was also a bullseye. There was 80 mature lobsters in this one sea cave, and we put 4 in this particular area, and all of them were full, right? So we believe that the sea cave reef in Goleta will enrich the lobster fishery here locally tremendously, possibly even an order of magnitude increase. Haliotis corrugata, pink abalone, right? This shows that they live on there. I think that the local co-op probably put those on there to see how they would live, but I was happy to find them there. And Mexico's interesting because they had to close their abalone fishery for 8 years because there was a mortality event, there was a die-off, and everybody played along, and then the abalone have come back at a lot of Mexico, and their fisheries management agency has given all the cooperatives different quotas, all the way up to 50 tons for some of them, a good quota. And I'm swimming around looking at the same seafloor I looked at 20 years ago that had no abalone on it, and I look at it now and it has the same amount of abalone that it did in the mid-'80s. So, the fishermen cooperated and they were rewarded for it, and I hope to see that someday take place here. This was the first fish ever caught on Tina Reef. I let it go, but I put it here for a specific reason, because we need to provide fishing opportunities, especially for young people that need to put down the video game, console and get back out into nature. The Fish Reef project it's a general environmental project, but our board of directors and the founders, including myself, we do have a fishing background. A lot of us are spear fishermen, and we really do believe in mankind's right to get their own protein from the ocean by their own hand outside of the corporate system, or at least by small vessel fishing. We believe that to be a fundamental human right. So it's hard to read that one. Going into the biogenic reefing, and let me step out here. So let's skip forward to the next slide. It's pretty tough to read that one on here. I think I went into most of these components about the biogenic reefing. This is in South Carolina. The Department of Natural Resources out there bought the first 4 sea caves that we made here in Santa Barbara and trucked them all the way out there, and they deployed them in their marine protected area. And what you're looking at is the colonization after just 3 months. That was 2 years ago, so we're waiting with bated breath to see what it looks like, to see if there's actually any coral growing on it. But the entire cast of characters is there, a very large gray snappers. There were amberjacks swimming over the top. It was really impressive to see. Those are chub mackerel and spadefish and, all those funny East Coast fish. The UN has these development goals that they would like to bring the whole world up to speed. And we focus, of course, on number 14, life underwater, also climate action. But life underwater is, this is the decade of the ocean that the UN, this is the decade of the ocean, and this is still the most underfunded of all of the sustainable development goals by 300 or 400%. And there's a reason for that. It's because the ocean is a cruel mistress. The ocean is very, very hard to work in. It's very hard to create something lasting and meaningful and durable. We have spent 14 years to be able to do this. And a lot of organizations just don't have that level of expertise or backbone or insanity by some measures. Right, so this is one mechanism to pay for it, because when we make the reef off of Goleta, it's just 16 sea caves. We had to go through the full permitting regimen, which I'll get into in a moment. But to fund it, we do plan on packaging and selling the blue carbon. So 90% of all the carbon dioxide that mankind has emitted over the past 150 years is stored in a big belt out in the ocean. And it goes up and down with the upwelling. And when it comes up, it can actually cause ocean acidification, and it can erode the calcium-based shells of anything with the calcium-based shell. So we're packaging the carbon dioxide into blue carbon credits, and we already have all of the science and what's called validation and verification on different registries to where this can make a very nice impact investment. What is impact investing? In its purest sense, that's somebody who wanted to donate a large amount of money, but they want a deliverable for it. They want to see that something's going to happen with it, and they value the positive impact to the ocean or society equally to their financial return. I haven't seen a lot of evidence of that. Usually it's still skewed where the financial return still outweighs the benefit, but true impact investing values the outcome of the impact. And so if anybody's interested in that, I'll be happy to talk to you afterwards. Our molds are transportable and stackable, and that way we can deploy. We're going to manufacture them in Mexico, and then they'll be brought up here, and the molds will be here for manufacturing, but they can also be exported around the world easily. Mobilization and demobilization. This is a depiction of what a high volume manufacturing facility would look like, where we have 250 of these molds, and we're doing runs 2 and 3 days a week, and we're loading barges with 2,000 and 3,000 of them on a barge at a time. And that sounds like a lot, well, because it is, but it sounds like a lot, but the reefs, the biogenic reefs, have to be of adequate size and scope to where they're exporting marine life out of them, back onto the natural reefs, back into the MPAs, and also absorbing some of the overflow from marine protected areas. So when a small fish leaves the MPA, it has a place to survive, right? Because a lot of the open area is just kind of no man's land. There's not a lot of structure. So when a small fish swims outside of a marine protected area, it's very vulnerable. So size does matter in this case. If it's too small, it just remains an attraction device. When you're actually trying to increase the output of entire biological systems in the ocean, you do need to make a significant impact. The science is a big deal. So we do a lot of baseline monitoring before they go in, and then our scientists monitor 4 times a year for 7 years after the sea caves go in, and all of that science is on our website. As you can go there now, and you can see the monitoring reports from Mexico, and then the pre-monitoring reports from Goleta. This is a simulation of water flow. So as you can see, it creates eddies in those 2 V shapes behind the cluster of 8. And that's the configuration that we're placing them in, is clusters of 8 with a 14-foot span of sand between them, so the water can move, the sunlight can penetrate, because if they're all clustered, you can choke out the sunlight like the canopy on on a rainforest in the Amazon. So you want to allow sunlight to penetrate so all the little stuff, the understory, the small algae grows, and you have a much more balanced ecosystem. If it's just choked out from too much light, you get kind of a monoculture crop. So the V in the back is important because that's upwelling, and the little plankton are back there kind of spinning around in circles, and that's when the big fish show up, and big fish eats little fish, and so on and so forth. But it kicks off the ecosystem. One of the cool things about this is if we take funding from somebody and they say we want to pay for 20,000 sea caves. Normally, when you donate money or give money to something in the marine environment, it's hard to measure the outcome. So let's say that you're transplanting seagrass or you're transplanting coral or mangroves. A hurricane comes through, messes everything up. Who knows what happened? This, with multi-beam sonar, every single sea cave has a geotag on it. So year in, year out, you're going to be able to see a report and see exactly what you got. And here's proof of it. This is an actual side scan sonar of our Mexico Reef, which is currently 300 feet long by 65 feet wide. Off to the right is an actual picture of it. And I love the randomness of this. I would, because that's what nature would do. It would just kind of go in and make a chaotic, random reef. I would love to take credit for that, but that's because boats are very hard to anchor in the wind, is what happened there. But it turned out it was a very happy ending in that sense. So this is our team to the right in the U.S. and the Fish Reef Project in Mexico with Ulysses Uribe, who's also in charge of the commercial diving component. He'll be up here when we deploy in Goleta. Total ecosystem approach. If we find that seagrass used to be somewhere or mangroves used to be somewhere adjacent to our reefs and it serves the reefs to repopulate the mangroves or the seagrass, we do undertake that effort. And that's why we call it the total ecosystem approach. Coral planting can happen, just like kelp planting can happen, but if you're around enough natural seed stock from wild coral, it's not necessary. What it really is a good way to involve the local community, especially in some of the foreign operations, such as in Papua New Guinea. When you give the local community ownership, they protect the reef. In Papua New Guinea, which is where we made the very first man-made reef ever in the history of this amazing country. This is Macy Luss, our executive director, who does a great job down there. We went down there and we made the first reef. And they signed an accord. The village elders signed an accord that said they agreed to ban dynamite fishing in exchange for the reef. And they've honored that. This is Bangladesh, which is a fascinating place if anybody's ever been there. They have several hundred miles in the Bay of Bengal that leads down to the Myanmar border that's just all sand, and they fish in these really colorful sand pans all day long. There's no electronics or anything like that, and they catch these small fish called hilsha, and they do have some fisheries depletion issues. So if they had a bunch of nearshore vibrant reefs full of snapper, grouper, and lobster, their food security would be much greater. And with the cost of grain going up because of the war in Ukraine, feeding their mariculture, their shrimp and their tilapia, the cost of that has gone up, pushing a good chunk of that population into food security. So creating a way for nature just to make food is a way around that. This is our team in Bangladesh, run by Mr. Mahmood. This is West Africa. We've been active there for some time. This is in Ghana. Food security is germane to the future security of West Africa. You have to do things that complement what they're already doing. If you show up and you want to change a bunch of things, it's not going to work. You also have to do things that don't require a lot of husbandry or maintenance. You have to do things that don't create conflicts for land use. That's why the Sea Cave is a perfect solution. We're very close to moving forward with a major production hub in Dakar, Senegal, that will serve the northwest component of Africa, and down in Angola as well. And we've been on again, off the Horn of Africa. We would very much like to serve Kenya and even Somalia because they're recovering from conflict and they need food and they need jobs. Here we are. So this is a mixture of Ghana and Senegal. We've met with all their ministries and things like that. And there's our construction manager, Lonnie Nelson, in the upper right. They're having a good laugh, because when you show up in underserved parts of the world, and after a while, they begin to realize that you're there to just kind of reinforce and empower what they already are. You're not there as some foreign colonial power to extract resources and leave, which unfortunately is their past, right? So it's very touching in a lot of ways to be involved in this. It's a very gratifying thing. Drought-proof food supply, right? So we tend to think, oh, that's for Africa. Drought-proof food supply is a tongue twister, right? COVID, could you get your tennis shoes on time? I couldn't, right? You couldn't get anything that you ordered on time. Well, our food supply was that close to vaporizing. If those trucks stop rolling, you have about a week, and Gelson's is empty. There's nothing in there. So through creating our own, essentially, default food reserve, through making reefs out here, that is our own food security. And as we see, pandemics are kind of part of the picture. So I know we don't tend to think like that. We tend to go into the fish market and buy. But having access, let me pose a question in your minds. If the food ran out tomorrow, what would we do? What would we do? Well, most of us would turn to the ocean or buddy up to somebody who could access the ocean is what we would do. Right, so reduction in conflict. All over the world, the seascape is changing. You're seeing offshore oil off of Africa. You're seeing offshore wind. You're seeing desalination. You're seeing floating cities. You're seeing whole entire new cities being built out into the ocean. And that always, for some reason, displaces the fishing community. Here, when you fish next to an oil rig, maybe you get within 100 meters and they say, oh, don't fish so close to the oil rig. In Africa, you have to stay 20 miles away from any oil rig, and for some reason, that's always where all the fish are. So you're really talking about displacing folks. This is in a place called Elmina in Ghana. And conversion of fisheries. Conversion of fisheries. This is another thing that humans can do. So if you're used to catching what you would call sort of topwater clupeids, like shads, small jacks, things have really low market value, really low nutrition. That's typically what the offshore African fishery in a lot of places go after. But if you create a thriving coastal reef, number one, they can reduce their fuel burn, and that goes for Santa Barbara Harbor too, by 80%. And a huge amount of their money is just burned up in fuel, and also in Santa Barbara. If you can go fish in Goleta instead of going out to Miguel, you're going to save a lot of money. And then if you convert it to a higher value fishery and you're catching snapper, grouper, and lobster instead of a sardine, it's a good day. So this is just kind of meant to demonstrate that whenever, there's kind of this movement to feed more people around the world, but it still requires land conversion. A lot of times it equals slash and burn, so now you have more CO2 release. Sometimes people get into armed conflict over it. Fresh water use. Where are you going to get the fresh water to grow all the crops? When we make sea caves in the developing world, we use salt water in the concrete. We don't even use the fresh water supply. You put it in the ocean, no more fresh water required to get that entire sustainable food supply that is drought-proof. So I've been working at the UN Seabed Authority for 8 years. We got voted in by 170 countries. It was like getting jumped into the world's biggest gang. When I first showed up at this, I'm like, what am I doing here? And you're sitting alongside the 12 largest environmental NGOs in the world. I think we all know who they are. And then the whole animal of the UN itself, all the diplomats, and then sort of like the military-industrial complex that's in there. And the prize is what you see in the upper left. Those are little balls of metal in 15,000 feet of water halfway to Hawaii called manganese nodules. And for 35 years, they've been working on developing code on how to go mine these, because it's the single most valuable asset on the face of the earth, valued in the trillions, because it's going to propel mankind to a carbon-free future somewhat, to where, that's really the linchpin to going all electric and having all kinds of gadgets and aerospace and stuff like that. I went there because there was nothing in the code that said that you have to fix what you broke. That if you're going to go muck up the whole middle of the ocean, You have to do something to repair it. You have to mitigate, you have to remediate, you have to repair. So I fought for 8 years to get one line of code, and we succeeded. So now this entire enterprise has to account for this impact, and they have to offset their impact. Of course, we tell them you should be making biogenic reefs using sea caves in the coastal zone so humans can get some benefit, because these minerals belong to everybody in the world. Belong to everybody in the world. Think of Saudi Arabia in the 1850s when it was being mapped out by the British, but in this case, it's in the middle of the ocean and it's owned by the international community. Okay, Rincon Island. We drive up and down it. What is it? Who owns it? I'll cut to the chase. The state owns it, okay? We've had some very productive conversations with them about a light repurposing. It's not going to be removed. The environmental impact is too great. The cost is too great. It hasn't made oil in a long, long time. It is an oil derrick. It was put in 1956, I think, and there was oil machinery that went 15,000 feet under the surface there. We wanted to convert it into a reef learning center, also known as the Climate Mitigation and Reef Research Center, if that isn't a mouthful. But basically, we would just put facilities out there where PhD candidates and master's students can go out there and they can make any shape reef they want with a 3D concrete printer, and then we will get leases on the edge of it to be able to place those down, and we can study fine nuance of how exactly to place structures and what shape for what species and really increase our knowledge. So they'll be studying making reefs in the middle of a reef. This thing is a reef. It's highly productive for lobsters. I don't know how many millions of dollars the lobsters come off it a year, but it's very productive. And so that's what it would be. It'd be a light repurposing. So this is on the list of things that we're working on. Platform Holly. Is it coming? Is it going? Is it coming? Is it going? I don't know. It depends on the day. It depends who you ask. But one thing, and all of the rest of the rigs, but one thing is pretty clear, is at some point it's going to be either fully or partially removed. I do not think it's going to remain there. The way the law works is the onus is on the original owner, which is ExxonMobil at this point. If they only partially remove it and try to save some money, they're going to cut it off at 85 feet, which destroys everything in the photo zone. So all the good stuff, with the exception of the rockfish down below, the sebastes. These oil rigs are the single greatest repository of the California rock scallop that exists. There are millions of them. They're big. It's basically an intertidal habitat. So if they remove that and they take it and they throw it in the trash, it seems reasonable to me that they should have to mitigate for that loss of marine life, okay? Which means we just happen to have a nice big reef right here in Goleta that qualifies for that. Okay, this is what everybody's been waiting for. So 1972, big kelp bed. Maybe some of you folks remember it. In fact, there was a giant kelp bed that was about 600 feet wide that basically went from Refugio to Ventura. It was so thick you could hardly get out of the harbor. 2020, no kelp. What happened was in 1983, we had this huge consistent swell in that massive El Nino, and it just scoured the seafloor. And it removed all of the structure that the kelp grew on. And then it wasn't replaced. A lot of the structure are basically boulders that come off the hills, and that's what the kelp grows on. Some of the kelp does grow directly into the sand on worm tubes, but all of that was removed. This is a section of a map made by the U.S. Geologic Survey in 1912, where they drew pretty pictures of all the kelp from the Columbia Gorge in Oregon all the way to central Baja. As you can see, it's wide and thick and heavy. The maps drawn at the Channel Islands at the same time show that the kelp was lighter at the islands than the coast. I'm going to repeat that. The kelp was thicker on the coast than it was at the islands. We tend to think of the only place that kelp exists is at the islands. So the loss of this is really the loss of the center of our entire marine ecosystem. So if you lived out in the redwood forest and you removed all the redwoods, that's where we're at right now. The good news is we're going to put the redwoods back underwater anyway. So this is the Goleta outfall pipeline, which is about a mile long, and it takes treated effluent out about a mile. And it's covered in ballast rock that weigh 300 to 500 pounds. It's just a normal chert quarry rock, but it's a beautiful habitat for kelp. lobsters, there's a couple of abalone on it, there's lingcod, there's rockfish. It's a thriving marine ecosystem, there's no doubt about it. And what it does is it inadvertently proved that kelp wants to grow in Goleta Bay. It just needs structure. That's what it proves. This is a sample of the rocks, unfortunately, that caused so much havoc in Montecito and in 2017. Those are the rocks that are supposed to end up in the ocean every 200 years and recharge the reef habitat. Humans stop those rocks from going in the water because we have houses and hedges and roads that are in the way. Okay, we stopped them from going in the water. We stopped our own reef from being reformed. The good news is sea caves can fill this niche. So this is the permitted pilot project. We're fully permitted for it, and I'll get into what those permits are in a moment. The permit is just for a 60-foot by 60-foot patch of the center of Goleta Bay in 40 feet of water, where we're going to place 16 sea caves in about 10 days' time if we get the weather window. And the whole purpose is to basically just show the community that this works, this is safe, the sea caves aren't going to roll around in heavy surf, the kelp will grow on them, the fish will thrive, and it doesn't cause any negative impacts. And then after that, we will move to phase 2, which is 65 acres. So this is an actual picture of the pre-deployment surveys that we had to do for the Department of Fish and Wildlife and the Army Corps of Engineers. As you can see, there's nothing down there but sand. There's a couple worms. I think I saw one clam. But that's what's down there right now. Sea otters. So it's come to my attention, you know, I think one of the urchin divers asked me, so aren't you worried that the sea otters are going to go in there and just eat anything that grows on it? And I would normally say, yeah, I actually am kind of worried about that. This is inverse thinking. The Elwood oil field that seeps 20,000 gallons a day of natural crude oil all across that bight from basically from Platform Holly all the way down to Goleta, I believe is a natural barrier to sea otters because they have that fine pelt with 1 million furs per square inch that requires, you know, eating a dozen abalone a day, a couple of rock crabs, a few starfish to maintain. They don't have any fat, right? So yes, they would graze and you would lose the shellfish if they did show up. That is a fact. But I believe that they're not there now because of the natural oil seepage. Another purpose that the Fish Reef Project fills is communicating the best knowledge to the public about what we see with our own observations about what creates the greatest possibilities for the most ocean health. Sea otters are a flashpoint subject for a lot of people. We're not shy from having those frank discussions. But I'll leave this very important subject matter at this. The map that I showed you from 1912 depicts a very robust kelp bed. That's when the otters were depleted to almost zero. There's thriving kelp beds all up and down Baja, Santa Barbara Island, San Clemente Island, the backside of Catalina Island, Guadalupe Island. There's no sea otters there. So to say that you absolutely have to have sea otters to have healthy kelp, I would just put that evidence in front of you and say, you know, draw your own conclusion. But that's what I have seen. Phase 2, 65 acres, which is about that whole swath that you see there. Now, it's not going to be one solid mat of sea caves. They'll be in clusters of 8 separated by about 12 feet. So there's places for the flatfish to sit, ambush predators, lobster traps can fit in there. And this is the first stage, right? This is a $20 to $25 million project. It's a very serious project. But I'll put that, if you just put a check mark next to that price tag for just a second, because I want to give sort of a relative context of that money. This is also about what 65 acres looks like. Now again, that kelp forest went all the way down. So when we complete this, we will continue until we have recovered our entire historic kelp forest. So we're not going to stop until we get it. Permitting. This is what 14 years worth of work looks like. Okay? I will say we were treated with a very high level of professionalism from the state and federal agencies. The fees weren't waived or anything like that. But there was a long-held belief that you just can't do this in California. But we proved that not to be true. So this is our first Garibaldi. Okay, the California state fish. This Garibaldi is very scared because it's in Mexico and you're allowed to eat them down there. But I still took a picture of it. So these are some of our wonderful donors. We have a matching roundup program going with a wonderful tea company in Oxnard called Tea Chino. I believe Caroline, the CEO, is here tonight. There we go. Thank you for that. So if you want some good tea, get that. So this is the last slide. So this is where I'm going to put that $20–25 million in context. Number one is an impact investment. It's not that massive as an investment. As a donation, I was out mattress shopping the other day with my wonderful gal Amy here. And their proprietor told me that they make $1 million mattress. $1 million mattress. And people buy them. And I'm like, so for the cost of a few mattresses, we could have our entire kelp forest back? And I mean, I suppose it's a kind of a cosmic belief, but if you're wealthy and have a fortune and you're just buying self-serving materialistic goods, good on you. I wish everybody in the world was billionaires. But after a while, that's got to feel a little bit lonely. It's got to feel a little bit sad. So if you were to divert some of that cash and create a legacy that's going to last for 500 years, 500 years, rebuild this kelp forest. And we'll do that for you. I can look you right in the eye and say, we will do that for you. It's not a dream. We've proven that it's possible. The technology's there. The permitting's there. So if you're able to make that happen, great. We'll do that for you. And the rest of your fortune will feel better for you. You can donate up to $60,000 directly on the website. Any large checks can be mailed in. The address is on the website on the donation page. We are already qualified with all of the donor-advised funds, such as Fidelity and Washington Mutual and Chase. So that money will go right through. You'll get a full state and federal tax deduction. If the donation is large enough, we can talk about naming the reef after you. So it depends on the size. So that's my presentation. Thank you very much. I'm happy to take questions. She asked, what happened to the original kelp forest? We lost the habitat that the kelp was hanging onto, basically, and that's why we need to replace it. And there's been a lot of siltation over the years that have prevented the regrowth.
Could you please repeat the size? I know you mentioned it at the beginning.
Of the sea cave? They're 2,400 pounds. They're 6 feet long by 3.5 feet wide by a little over 3 feet tall.
So the big fish fit in there.
They do, and we thought about that, right? So we wanted 50-pound snapper in there, right? We actually thought about that. It's a very good point because a lot of reefs have little tiny holes and they're good for clownfish and stuff like that. But we wanted some meat, And the lobsters respond to the size as well. So on that pipeline picture I showed you, there's a lot of lobster, but they're mostly very small, what you call young of the year, because the holes are small. Bigger the hole, bigger the fish, bigger the lobster.
What happened to our abalone farm?
What happened to our abalone farm? Well, the cultured abalone farm off Dos Pueblos is still very active and provides a nice product.
Oh, the pier isn't getting any. For about 3 months, you said they haven't been getting any.
Oh, well, we should have to check into that. We need our abalone. We need our abalone, cultivated abalone. We need our wild abalone fishery back, too, because that's part of our maritime heritage.
What are the permitting costs? Is habitat, and do you see that likely to come down because less studies are needed in the future once it's proven itself?
Right. No, I'd say, again, it's inverse logic. I think the costs would go up just because the standard for monitoring basically goes up. But I will say this, that all of the permits that we obtained are the exact same permits for the pilot project, are the exact same permits we'll need for the full-size project. So we know exactly the way forward, and we put the cost of that at about $300,000 and about 18 months, including the EIR. So that would be a very good mid-level funding target for us to go move forward with that. That doesn't cover any administration or salaries. A lot of us have worked for this whole time. I think I drew a salary for 6 months, and I gave all the money back to the project so we could finish it. The initial one is, yeah. The question was the size of the pilot project, he asked, 60 by 60 foot. It's a very good question. So she asked, when do we expect results for Goleta? It'll probably be on par with Mexico. So, I mean, there we saw, it depends on what time of year that you place them. So that's why we're really pushing to get these in the water in the next 10 months, because in the winter, spring months is when the seed settles. And then when you get the long days, the photo period shifts in June, and you get a 10-hour day is when they kind of spring to life. So if we get the timing right, we should start to see results by June or July. If we miss that loop, it might push it out another 6 or 7 months, but certainly within a year.
How are you going to protect these from overfishing and overutilization until you get enough out there to?
That's a good question. I prefer the term mismanagement versus overfishing. So basically, fishing has limitations to it. You can't be two places at once. So if somebody is fishing there, by default, they're not fishing on a natural reef. So that part's good. So, and they will, and you know, the only thing that is basically subject to that would be, say, the lobsters, but they tend to move through. You tend to get big pops of them our population blooms at the beginning and the end of season when they're spawning. You know, but we do put the word out. We do ask fishermen to just kind of take it easy. It is sovereign property of the state. We don't own it. It is our permit, but it's managed like any other piece of reef that's out there. Once you're correct, once we have large enough scale, it becomes much less of an issue. So we do ask folks to just kind of take it easy on it.
Why not put it in a reserve?
Why not put it in a reserve? Well, in South Carolina, they did. Right?
What about Goleta?
Right. Well, I mean, the permitting hurdle is different there. Plus, you can't fish on them in a reserve, and fishing's important to us. Yeah.
I don't often think about the kelp being growing and this all being reestablished, and then an industry coming in, which they already exist, to harvest the kelp and
Yeah, so I understand that viewpoint, because in the past there was a company called Kelco that was hugely industrial, and a lot of people have memories of that from the 70s and 80s. We had a 300-foot kelp harvester. Now in the area that the reefs will grow, that kelp harvesting lease is restricted to just the abalone farm to feed their abalone, and they only have a fixed extraction of, I think, 18 tons a day. So it's inherently bottlenecked and limited. It would be legally impossible for that to occur.
Is the Goleta pipeline producing all the rocks and then producing kelp also?
Yeah, that's what we showed you, and that.
So this is just an extension of that way. It's already working. It's just a little farther away. You're going to put your new facilities.
Right, so the question and statement was, is the Goleta pipeline the rocks producing kelp? The answer is yes. And it's already working, yes, and it is an extension of that. So you're kind of teeing into an existing ecosystem that will help propagate the reefs.
I'm just curious, I keep thinking, like, why not also put a bunch of rocks down there? I mean, obviously, it's design, but does that come up? Like, you could get more bang for your buck if you also put rocks in?
So the question is, why not just use quarry rock? So in our sort of our early days of due diligence and learning these things, at first blush, it does look like quarry rocks are the way to go. But number one, you have to blast them off of somebody's hillside and create that environmental impact. There's not enough in California, so you have to import them from Mexico, typically. But the real reason is there's not enough what you call interstitial space when you pile them up. So you might take 3 tons of quarry rock and get one little cave for fish and lobsters. You take the same weight in concrete, and you end up with an extrapolated habitat for the same footprint.
Two questions, the CO2 in the concrete and how are you mitigating that? Number two, you have one size fits all.
Mhm.
Would it be, have you looked into having 3 or 5 different size caves? Does that make a difference?
Right, so the question is on the CO2 footprint of the concrete. It's a great question. So the concrete that we source comes from manufacturers like Cemex that use a containment dome and pump about 80% of the CO2 basically into ground reservoirs, and then it gets used for different things like making beer and stuff like that. But even if there is a slight footprint from that heating process, when they go in the water, we have extremely good science that proves that each sea cave will sequester 4 to 6 tons a year of carbon dioxide directly from the water. So let's say that you have 100 pounds of carbon dioxide off-gassed from the construction of one sea cave. That's going to be made up for many, many times over through the sequestration by growing the kelp once it's in the water.
And then the second question, with different sizes.
Right. The question is, why don't we have different sizes? We have designed different sizes, but when you have, first of all, limited resources, and you have a tooling of a production facility, and you need to create a reef of a certain size, you really have everything built around that one size. So how many fit on the truck, how many you pick up with a bar, how many go in, and then the monitoring and the sonar and so on and so forth. So we have experimented with things like stacking them, one on top of the other underwater, to see if you get more fish because it's higher profile, and you don't, right? So that kind of emulates that. It was just kind of a bullseye. What makes a bigger size is by clustering the 8 together. So that, in theory, makes its own reef, because the fish and the lobsters and the animals, they dart in one of these things, and then they go through the labyrinth of all of them that are connected, not just one. So it really gives the animal the advantage from, a human sticking their hand in there or something like that. What would be the impact of the next big El Nino? Right. So the problem really isn't El Nino. It's always been here. It's definitely part of the stimulus of the California environment. It's what cleans and kicks off the entire ecosystem, and it's not inherently a bad thing. The problem comes when you have back-to-back El Ninos like we had in 2014, 15, 15, 16, because you don't have time for the ecosystem to swing back. So if climate change causes more back-to-back El Ninos, it is a problem. But we answer that by saying that you want more reef structure in the water, just like you want more chaparral in the hills after a fire. Because El Nino is basically a fire underwater, right? So now you've created more structure and more opportunity for the ecosystem to swing back faster than it otherwise would in the face of more El Ninos. Thank you very much.